Well, we're gonna start with watching a film, and so that will be really nice just to sort of see the work. We've got Sumit Sarkar here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This is going to be an absolute treat. We've got an artist who works both with digital and with analog, so you've got this like sort of like dual left and right brain thing going on, haven't you? Well, so what's really exciting is we get to see how the sort of like you combine the digital with the sort of like, sort of the hand-based work. And so it's going to be really exciting. Let's watch the video.
Yeah, I'll talk about that piece a bit later. So hi everyone, my name's Sumit Sarkar. I'm a painter and sculptor. I'm going to be talking for about an hour about my work and the sort of relationship between painting and sculpture, digital and traditional, analog if you will, and more recently figurative to abstract work. And I guess I should say that it's not a linear journey. It goes forward and folds back on itself and contradicts itself and then merges together. So I'm going to go quite far back. One of the things is I think when I was a kid and when I was at school and college, it felt like there were three different strands which eventually sort of come together. But there was the proper fine art stuff. So I was looking at all the traditional fine artists. But I also was really into comics and cartoons and graffiti and skateboard design. So that was happening, but I kind of kept that secret, private to the school fine art proper stuff. But then also I was really interested in digital artwork. And this goes back right to the 80s, and I remember on our second computer, we had a ZX Spectrum, then we had the Amstrad CPC 6128, do you remember it?
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, me and my sister spent hours copying pages and pages of code from the back of the manual that came with it, and you were supposed to be able to make an art program. And I don't know if we got lines wrong, but it didn't really work very well. But it kind of worked, but it was very glitchy, but it was unusable. But basically, there was no mice back then. It was all cursor keys. and it was the most basic art program, which was like dropping a black pixel on a white background, and you would sort of move the cursor, and it was a pixel at a time. So that's where it started. And then a few years later, my parents got me an Amiga 500, and this program is Deluxe Paint 3, I think this one is, at the start of 2, and this one blew my mind because at first it was, you can see there's like a couple of versions of each primary colour, and then importantly, like more than 10 shades of grey, which felt to me like the beginning of digital painting, because you could really think about shadows and light as if you were painting. And it was particularly useful if you were into painting metal and robots, which I was and still am. Most of the work is sort of unsalvageable on discs and on computers that have been thrown away, but luckily my friend at school printed out some things on a dot matrix printer at school years ago. So a few have survived, but what you don't get is like, even back then, the digital quality of seeing it on a screen, you would have had like a really clean graphic, but this is like dot matrix, so it's all dotty, but it's kind of nice for what it is. I'm fast forwarding a few years, but relatively not that many. So what I was doing in my fine art practice, if I can call it that, while I was at school, was very sort of traditional and maybe predictable teenage angsty kind of work. I was inspired by Francis Bacon and Edvard Munch, that kind of quite self-obsessed kind of painterly artwork. And it kept me going for a while, but when I got to my foundation course at Camberwell College of Arts, I met this artist, Rio Okamoto, who's still my favourite artist. And what he was doing was, at the time, it felt really revolutionary. So he was essentially doing cartoons on canvas, which I had never seen before, in 1996. And it was melding Basquiat's work with manga. So he was doing his own stuff, but he was also like actually referencing pages from famous manga books and sort of painting them in a very Basquiat kind of way. And I was experimenting. It was sort of around, I think it was just before Sensation, but you're kind of looking at trying to find I was painting with mud and all kinds of, just experimenting. But I felt that was his thing. But then when I went to visit him, he'd gone to St Martin's and I came to Manchester to do my degree in fine art. And his work had like evolved a massive step, and it had become like quite painterly and like more mature and darker. And I remember on the sketch on the train on the way back home, I did this character, and yeah, so when I mentioned I had like these two, the three strands of my work, I used to have two sketchbooks. So I'd have my fine art sketchbook and then the comic cartoony one. And at this moment, they became one. And I had this sort of Crick character that was sort of, he came into the fine art book and he lost his superpowers and his muscles, and he became this like flawed man-child demon with demons kind of thing. And I kind of felt like I could do my own take on it. Didn't feel like I was stepping on Rio's toes. Yeah, I think what I liked about it was I was able to use sort of cartoon iconography as a sort of a metaphor for kind of maybe darker things, or like I could sort of talk almost abstractly about what I wanted to say without it being too obvious. So kind of hiding behind icons and metaphors, but then also the primary colours of a cartoon and that simple style to counterbalance quite dark themes often, and yet a picture of loads of sketchbooks that I really felt like I found myself at that point. It was like I was just constantly drawing and just loads of ideas, and it felt like I was able to express for the first time sort of the ideas that I had. And then, so also while I was at university, I sort of made sure that my summer jobs and work experience was all around graphic design companies. So this was the first time I'd used Photoshop, which again was another step up. And suddenly you went from the Amiga with its 20 odd colours to millions of colours, being able to work on different layers, really advanced tools, and being able to undo and all of that. So this was the first couple of digital paintings. And these are actually, again, I don't know if I've got the original files, these are photos of prints. And then there was the brave move to actually bring I'd already brought the comic stuff into the fine art work at university, but then I brought the digital work into university. So back in those days, I think I was mainly like sketching or painting and then scanning and then bringing it in to my computer. But as it's evolved, I actually now do all the sketching and most of the work purely digital. Again, similar themes as the work before. Yeah, much more of the same. And then also, while I was at university, there was a chance sketch of a character that struck me as looking like the Hindu god Shiva. And it looked like a modern version of it, which inspired this idea of a new body of work, which would be reimagining the Hindu pantheon as per my understanding of it, and to sort of reinvent it for a modern age. When I was a kid, I used to get these comic books from India that would tell the stories of the Hindu gods in comic book format, I loved them when I was a kid. So I was kind of quite familiar with a lot of the stories. But then I got really into it and bought a few mythology books, and there was like this wealth of stuff to have ideas for artwork for. So for example, this image, Shiva famously has the third eye. Each story has like 100 or 1,000 different variations, but this version he was meditating on a mountain and his partner Parvati playfully covered his eyes, and because he is the universe, the whole world was consumed in darkness. And then he had to sort of have a third eye to issue light into the world. So, an example of all these stories that I could get some ideas from. And also, while I was at university, these are still from work at university, all digital. And I had loads of creative fun redesigning the gods. And there are all these weird logics at play. So there was always balancing. The gods sort of came in male-female pairs, but I was also balancing a sort of internationalism to them, so they weren't all Indian, but also robotics and human. So, for example, Vishnu here is a god of preservation, so that means he's the god who comes to Earth and takes different forms to balance Dharma in the world. So that to me said transformation. So there he is transforming, and that meant metallic, and his partner was goddess of love, so she was very human, and it made sense at the time. It still makes sense to me. And then destruction, so there's Shiva again, and his partner Durga, who also takes the form of Kali, and Parvati Durga. So it made sense that she was robotic and in balance. He was like the god of meditation and spiritual enlightenment, but he would also be the one that would lose his temper and destroy the universe. So it kind of made sense that he was human or organic at least. But yeah, so back in those days, the focus was still very much the Hindu work, and I had this idea. I wanted to develop the Hindu work into an exhibition, and I had this idea of like a futuristic Hindu temple was the basic concept. So I got some. I think this was my second Arts Council fund to research and develop the idea. So with all of my projects with the Arts Council, it's developing your work and working with new technology. You got to make sure there's an exhibition in there for public engagement, and I always run workshops. So that was at what was then the Corner House, and then I also got my first. I didn't mention when I was doing the digital work at university. I got a graphics tablet, which meant you draw on a pen, on a pressure sensitive pen on a pad. So you had a bit of a hand-eye thing going on, but it was better than a mouse. And then the step up from that was kind of what I've got here, which is a draw-on screen tablet, which just makes it even better. And the graphics tablet I got back then, I still use every day. Yeah, but the main idea was sculpture. I sort of saw this exhibition as being an exhibition of Hindu sculptures, futuristic ones. So I started with the only thing I knew, which was clay. I didn't have any experience of sculpture because the university degree, you had to specialise, and I chose painting, but I was always interested in sculpture. Didn't really know what I was doing, but kind of worked out that you needed wooden armatures, especially with Hindu gods with their limbs going off in all directions, and that's my first attempt at a sculptural version of the Shiva Nataraja picture from before. And this one was a nightmare, limbs all in different directions, and he was really heavy, and he fell a few times and smashed. But the important thing from that was discovering that there was a digital version of sculpture. So a few years later, I went for the next Arts Council proposal to actually make the exhibition, and I discovered this process of 3D modelling. This was back in 2006-07 probably. So within this program, you can make your 3D models, and what I loved about it, similar to the painting work, was that level of control, so you could zoom in and you could literally sculpt in negative space and get inside the sculpture. But then importantly for this project was that you could actually essentially 3D print it. It was called rapid prototyping in those days. And it was a thing that was made. I hadn't heard of it mainly because it was used in industry for like car parts and like for prototyping. So it was unusual for me to be in there as an artist, but I managed to raise the. It was a very expensive process as well, but managed to raise the funds to work with the technology. And that's it. After the supports have been moved and it's all been smoothed out, and there is that sculpture finished. And then another sculpture from that exhibition, which is the Shiva Lingam, which is an iconic Hindu sculpture, but it was my version of. It's sort of like the male and female sex in unison, which I translated as robotic copulation. But finally, I found a process that I was happy with sculpturally to finally realise the Shiva Nasaraja from before. I think the original idea for that exhibition was all sculptures, but then I realised I couldn't afford that with the funds I had. But actually, it turned out that the obstacle led the path to a better idea. So within the same programme, you could make these 3D animations. So 5 of the gods I represented as these animations that I put on screens that were housed in these black monoliths that were inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then there was a central piece, which was another iconic Hindu image, Durga and her family, and that was a Photoshop painting, and at the time it was my most detailed digital painting, but we've fast surpassed that now. Okay, and then jump in somewhere completely different. Sort of concurrent to all of that work, I was invited to sort of paint on canvases at street art festivals, and this was one of the first times I actually worked with aerosol. So normally I was just a painter with a paintbrush, but all my peers were graffiti artists, and I finally kind of got into it. And it was mainly just a speed thing that really first got me into it, because they were the graffiti artists, they were working on much bigger canvases and they'd be finished in a fraction of the time, but it slowly bled into my own work. I was in Cambodia. It took some time out before I got the decision from the Ananta project, and I'd run out of money after a month, which was supposed to last 3 months, and I was in a bar where tourists could just sort of scribble their names on the walls and stuff. I showed them my sketchbook, they gave me a wall, I did a painting on it, and they loved it, and they said, right, we're going to employ you to paint the whole bar and the upstairs that was being renovated, and I painted the ceilings, and it was a great random month. And that's, you can see how small I am. And so this is much more recent, but just to show like that work led to various sort of graffiti mural commissions and stuff over the years. I didn't see myself as a graffiti artist, I still don't really. But I've always been interested in graffiti letters and typography and calligraphy. My mum let me write my name in graffiti style when I was like 11 on my bedroom wall. So it's always been there, but I didn't really feel like I was a graffiti artist. But around this time when I was working with it a lot more, I kind of wanted a graffiti name. I think that's an important part of being a graffiti artist, is that whole process of having a graffiti name and just writing it over and over and over and over again in different styles, which I kind of wanted to get into. The Crick 6 name that I sort of use as an artistic pseudonym, but it's also the name, confusingly, of the character of the horns. It didn't feel relevant to like write Crick 6 on a wall. So I was looking for a name and I had a penny drop moment because it had to have my favourite letters in it. And it was a play on the word cursed, C-U-R-S-E-D, but misspelt. I think that's another graffiti thing, is misspelling words in a slightly cool way. But I just love the letters K-E-R-S-T, but also the word cursed sort of tied into the angsty themes of my work. But then also I had this idea that I could like tag rubbish, and I could work legally. So I could be doing graffiti illegally, but next to a policeman because it was just on rubbish. But I did a few of those, and it felt like too one-dimensional idea. I got kind of bored of it, and then I thought, well, what if you take aerosol out of the equation? So then I started to do these cursed graffiti tags from things that were cursed to be destroyed or dispersed or decay. So obviously making a cursed out of leaves, I recorded the process of me making it, but also it eventually drying and dispersing with the wind and rain and stuff. And then got permission from a primary school, got a load of Lego, made a curse out of Lego, and then overnight I had little torches on my fingers. And then when the kids came in the morning, they were encouraged to sort of take it apart and make their own thing. So they did that until there was nothing left. And then the curse car that you saw at the beginning, that was from a scrapyard. So I'll talk about it a bit later, but I've always been interested in sort of taking away the value of art. So that got crushed at the end, and and then a cursed nibbles for the opening. And then the curse car led to another tangential project, Buzzbeak. Someone had seen Curse Car, and the project in Shetland was all about theatre, but with cars as actors and stuff. And they wanted to commission a piece that was, the brief was made from a car, interactive and musical. So I think what they were imagining was they would pair me with like a steel drum musician maker, and that I would make something like Curse Car. And I wasn't really I didn't really want to repeat the idea. It didn't quite make sense for that. So they gave me some development time, and I had this idea of, well, what if you get a car and you transform it into a sonically, digitally interactive bird? I went into I can't remember if I'm really into Transformers, in case I haven't mentioned that. I went into the pitch with my first ever Transformer, which was like a tape player that would transform into a robot, and out of his chest, the cassette would come out, and that transformed into a condor. So I thought there was a musical link there, and the idea was to make a Land Rover Discovery into a condor. And we had 2 Land Rovers. One we transformed into this bird, and then the second one towed the other one, but also in that one, during the live shows, me and an electronica musician would be hidden in the second one. I'd be controlling the bird. It was all fully automated, and the audience could play music to her, or give it an MP3, or play vinyl. We had the whole thing, or just sing into a mic, and then it would appear that the condor was sort of absorbing the music and then playing it back as like alien music. And yeah, so I'll play a little video. So, and we decided that we needed an actor to help the audience interact with the things. It might not make sense otherwise. So I sort of wrote a part for an actor where she was like a facsimile construct, like a hollow matter version of the condor, and she would sort of work with the audience and get the music from them. I had this whole story about like how they were an alien race and they'd lost their soul or their spark, and they'd come to Earth to... I ripped off Starman and Transformers a lot.
We are the condor. We are Buzzbank. 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 You can sound our field from open us. Any word by rhythm or noise. You can
racing, slowly sinking, wasting, crumbling like pastries, and they scream. The worst things in life come free to us.
Another tangent, so by getting into the 3D animation work that you've seen with the Ananda stuff and then Buzzbeak, I kind of got into video mapping projects, so that's like projecting onto large buildings and making it look like the building was doing things. So this was a project in Finland, and it was a big collaborative project that I ended up directing, and there was puppeteers and dancers, and we had this huge building, and it was over a massive river, so we had these huge projectors on the other side of the river projected across. I'm just going to show you a little bit that I made. I made some content for it as well, and I transformed the building into a baby angel god demon robot thing. Right, and then the next project, jumping around again. So I had an exhibition at Z Arts in Hume in Manchester, and it's this huge, brilliant gallery space, and another Arts Council funded project, and I got my first 3D printer at home, so it was the first time that technology had started to become affordable. So I had this sort of challenge of like having something that could make things that were a few centimetres tall and this huge exhibition space to fill. So I had this idea for like basically combining all the different art forms. The whole series, there was a series of these works, and they were essentially just printed onto really a generic, valueless kind of printed canvas. Yeah, so each of those images contain like the pencil sketch, a digital sketch, the 3D model, a 2D render of the 3D model, the 3D print, photograph of the 3D print, and more digital painting. And I think I was sort of maybe a little bit frustrated about the valuelessness of digital artwork. I mean, you can sell prints and you can say, well, I'm only doing a few, therefore it's worth a bit more. But essentially, however much work I put into it, the thing on the screen was not really worth anything. And I don't know if it was frustration, but I kind of enjoyed playing with that anyway as well. So there was a series of those kind of works, but then also it was a big space, so I kind of wanted a few pieces of each of the different art forms. So this was a huge canvas. That's a straight 3D render as a print. There were little 3D prints in the space, and then mixing 3D print with paint. And then this was mixing a bit of everything and mirrors and just having fun with it, really. And then part of that project also was getting hold of motion capture equipment for the first time. So this was back in 2015. And it was that kind of like CGI Gollum type stuff, but it was becoming affordable. You didn't need a £1 million animation studio, but it was very limited. So I think with this, I had like the first iteration was I had 6 PlayStation Eye cameras all dotted around the room, and it would try and work out what your T-pose was, and then you would move and it would work it out. And then I worked with 2 Kinects, which worked better after all of that effort. It was great to be experimenting with that, but it wasn't really usable. It was just a bit too clunky. But then the face animation stuff was a lot more successful. I'm going to show you a little video. And the company that made that ended up getting bought out by Apple, and they were called Face Shift, and there's sort of the technology on iPhones where it can mimic your facial movements and make it as a character. That was them, and so that came off the market, so that was the end of that. Yeah, part of what I do, it's often collaborating with musicians and performers. So this project had Spy the rapper and Ben Mellor, a poet, Lainey, a singer, Benji Reed, choreographer, dancer, and Ali Gadima, a rapper producer. So it's kind of a rough video, but yeah.
You know what, I'm no GoBot. If I'm out function, so what? I raise my data with the laser. Rewire my desire for the great creator. But they can't reprogram the demon host with the hand of no man, not even close. Not even if they give it the most. I'm a mechanical animal with a digital ghost. Which human loser gave me?
My script when that captivating implodes in my visual cortex. I register how her skin glows. My plasma heart burns hard and bright like it might implode. Organic and the digital, manic individual, don't panic in the visible. Lazy as it's physical, respect is in the ridicule. My foes are feeling minuscule, it's lonely at the pinnacle. The
team was a meant to Decepticon and Autobots. Whatever the weather, slaughter lots, a square peg and your polka dots. What's the pickle, my pickles? I tear a hole in your thoughts and stick ring six in your riddles.
Then this is a little project. I got invited to go to residency in Sri Lanka to experiment and play with different ideas. And I kind of figured if I was being put on a beach in Sri Lanka that I would play with sand and went back to my roots and did clay sculpture and just played with different ideas. So there's photography mixed with clay sculptures and putting them in the ground and playing with the images. And I forgot to mention, so with that last project at Z Arts, the themes of it were mixing the religious stuff with the cartoony things. I was sort of seeing a parallel between some religious concepts of like enlightenment and chosen ones with sort of superhero movies and like moments where you discover your powers and stuff like that. So that I was sort of playing with the sort of the superhero archetype, and then with this project it was making it even simpler and just like head and hand emerging from a thing. So I was slowly moving away from complex figurative ideas, and this was one of my first times I had an idea for a picture that wasn't figurative at all. So I wouldn't call it abstract, it's sort of a weird floating building, but I was starting to get interested in non-figurative ideas. Then when back in the UK, my first introduction to virtual reality back in I think 2016 or 17, BBC Blue Room is a part of the BBC where they play with new technology, and they were looking for an artist who worked with sculpture and graffiti and digital stuff, and my name came up a few times. And this was before virtual reality you could buy it in a shop, so it was sort of early access stuff. So I was going into the studio and just playing with this new technology, and it's sort of kind of what I do with the 3D modelling, but in actual 3D space, which was a bit of a game changer, and I loved it. And this was a program called Google Tilt Brush. So it's kind of like painting, but in 3D space. And I think an analogy that someone used was it's like painting with ribbons. So it's not three-dimensional objects, but it's a three-dimensional shape with a flat plane attached to it. So it was sort of an early iteration of sort of VR sculpting. Yeah. And then later that year, and when it got released, I got hold of my own VR setup, and then there was this new program called Masterpiece VR, and it was a lot more sculptural. So it was a bit like actually sculpting with digital clay, and you could really take away and add as you would with clay. And what was great about it was its real 3D movement, like in out, and your movements are actually controlling the tool, which you're sort of mimicking on a 2D surface. And when I first started to use it, I thought that was it, that I would always be using, VR for the rest of my work. But it does some things very well, but it's not as powerful as a desktop computer. So I found myself hitting brick walls often. It's good for some things, but I default to sculpting on a normal computer in a 3D program, just because you can do a lot more and have more control. Right, and then another left turn. This was a project, I had this idea, I'd seen a few exhibitions with 3D printed work in them, but everything I was seeing was very much a mishmash of whatever you could do, so little green boats and funny little 3D printed pigs, but I hadn't really seen an exhibition that was work made in a sort of a fine art gallery with that kind of environment in mind. So I had this idea for an exhibition of British sculptors working with digital mediums. That was the idea. And the first artist I found, who I was well aware of before, was Keith Brown, who's a Manchester artist, and he's a bit of a legend in terms of digital artwork. I think he's probably using 3D print for 5-10 years before I'd even heard about it. And he helped identify some of the other artists as well, so he was a really important part of that exhibition. It was a funny project in that I'd set it all up. With Arts Council funding, you have to sort of raise at least 20%. So I'd managed to do that. I'd got 2 venues, I'd got all the artists lined up, and I got one of my no's, which was sort of really heartbreaking at the time, but everything was set up. So I rewrote the proposal and sent it back within like a week and a half. So I basically said, look, everything's set up. I've got the insurance and the transport covered, and we've got the artists. If you put in half, then we can at least commission each of the artists to make something new, so it's not just existing artwork. And they said yes. And with all my Arts Council projects, I end up at the end of my overdraft and completely bankrupt at the end of it. And this was especially the case with this one. But then, so this was one of the commissioned pieces, and by a brilliant artist called Annie Catchell. When that turned up, I was like, it's all worthwhile. I was going a bit mad otherwise, but beautiful work. She did a series of 3 of these pieces, and her work is all about like brain scans and body scans. And I think this was a part of her brain that was scanned, and she was making herself feel pleasure and pain, and it was like that part of her body in different states, and then cast in this resin. But another great thing that came out of it was meeting John Isherwood, another artist that Keith had put me in touch with to consider for the exhibition, and he was up for it. And he works predominantly in stone and marble. And what was really nice about his work, which was a bit of an eye-opener, was with everyone else's work, you can see it's all delicate 3D printed work and behind cages and display cabinets. He actively wanted people to touch it, because it's stone, and he would encourage it, and it would survive. But he runs this project called the Digital Stone Project in Italy, and we remotely became friends, and he invited me to apply for that, so I had another Arts Council fund to get there. And so this is a project where you work with a 7-axis robot arm that mills a big block of marble, and you send in your designs. So some artists would send a digital file that they worked on, or some people would make a sculpture and scan it and have that milled. So different approaches. So I kind of wanted to come in with as complex a thing as I could. And one of the things I think they came back and said it's too complex. Not that they couldn't do it, but part of the project is you get X amount of hours with the robot arm. So I kind of did a few iterations and eventually came back with something that was complex enough but doable within the time frame. So that's the software works out the milling, how it's going to mill it, and that's it being milled. And that is it after it's come out, and I think there's a bit of work on that. And that's it, completely finished. And so this was a very lucky thing. I got there, and mine was the only one that was broken, and everyone was really apologetic, and I was mostly excited because I was like, well, can I keep the broken one? And they was like, oh, yeah, completely, because it's sort of useless stone to them now. And that was good for a couple of reasons. That the first being that I got funding from the Arts Council to have a show in England, and I was going to show the marble work, but just the Digital Stone Project involves a group exhibition with 20-odd international artists and a group show at the end in Italy. So obviously I was like torn between, I would only have one sculpture and I'd have to choose which one I would show at. Benefits to both. And this meant I could have one in each, but it also meant I had this idea for, because all these processes are digital, the idea was you can make things with different processes and put them all together. And I had thought with year one of Digital Stone Projects, I knew immediately I wanted to go back every year I could. I should just work with stone and just get into the stone and not complicate things. But because I had this second opportunity, I pushed that forward. And so I scanned the broken sculpture, and designed these 3D printed parts. And then a company that I work with in Manchester, Dicey Tech, they printed these pieces out and sent them over to me, and then I sort of stuck them on and went crazy with this. I figured I could go crazy with it. So there's graffiti, there's aerosols in there, and there's ink, and like you can see the little X, and I've painted a drip that goes onto the plinth. So I just had a lot of fun with that one, and that was that. And then part of the same project, I wanted, this isn't my work, this is a stock sort of 3D print from this printer, the Stratasys J750, which I've been aware of for a few years, and it takes years for me sometimes to get the funding raised to do these projects. But finally, this was part of that project. And what this printer does, as you can kind of see, is it can print 6 different materials simultaneously. And one of those can be, or a few of them can be transparent, and you can mix all the different materials to make, loads of different variations of colours. So I was chomping at the bit to work with that technology. And again, similar to the marble, I was like, I wanted to work with the full build area of the 3D printer and to create a really complex thing. And they came back to me and said, you can't afford that. I can afford something about that big with my budget. But also, it was too complex, but also my file wasn't watertight. With this process, because you've got lots of different forms all overlapping and going in and out of each other, it all has to be perfect. So I simplified and kind of upped my skill set as well. I should probably mention the move from figurative to abstract work around this time. This was the first time that I felt I jumped into it. I think I was quite inspired by Keith's work and John Isherwood's. But this idea that, on the one hand, if you wanted to push technology, if you were limited by a kind of a figurative idea, that was a limit. That was as far as you could go with it. But with the abstracts, if you remember Keith's piece, you could really just you could be designing to push the technology. But then while I got into it, I felt like this work also sort of had a lot of all the other stuff that I was interested in. I think there's the graffiti in there, there's the Hindu Indian stuff, I think there's a lot of the personal human stuff in there for me. So it just felt like a nice way of working. So this was the digital render of that piece, and that is it, 3D printed. I think it's my favourite piece, but it's only tiny and it costs a lot to get that. So, not a technology I can work with whenever I want, which is, I guess, the only limitation of high-end technology. And then the next year's project, so yes, I knew that I wanted to go back to Digital Stone Project, but this time I wanted to work with 2 blocks of marble and the more advanced 3D print process that I'd worked with the standalone sculpture and put them all together. A thing about the Digital Stone Project is the best bit is when you first get there. So 20-odd artists from all around the world have sent their files, but you're not shown the milled work until you get there. So the best bit is when you all go down to the marble floor and everyone sees their milled marble for the first time. And the thing that I think no one expects, unless they've been there before, is those beautiful mill lines, the sort of the contours. Yeah, and I think a lot of the time you would think, oh, I definitely want to keep those in because they're so beautiful. But 9 times out of 10 you wouldn't, because it wasn't the intention of the piece. This year I was like, I really wanted to work and design with creating those mill lines in mind, so they were purposeful. So I asked this time to purposefully not mill mine until I got there, so I could sit with the engineer and actually kind of be involved in those decisions of the tool sizes and which angles, and so I was sort of controlling those mill lines, which I've got more into. So that's both the white and the black piece being milled, and then, so when I left the previous year, the first question, which I didn't think of while I was there, was can you export the milling simulations as a 3D file? And that's the easiest thing they could do. So he sent me last year's one straight away, and that means all those mill lines exist as a digital. The simulation is like 95% accurate. So this time, instead of scanning the marble, I had these digital files to work from, design these complex multi-material 3D printed parts, and you can just about see like there's sort of the mill lines that are actually from the stone digitally. And then the hope was that it would all fit together, and it did. And I sometimes think I'm the only one that gets excited by the fact that worked, and that 3D printed parts can fit onto mill lines, but I do. So, and then part of this, it was shown in Italy, but also I brought it back to Light Up Lancaster, and there was this idea of projection mapping onto the sculpture. So I'd sort of designed these very basic animations, but kind of playing with echoing those mill lines and that kind of thing. Yeah, and then another thing is augmented reality. So you might have seen with some phone apps that you can look at something and it will come to life on your phone. So I've been quite interested in making sculptures that come alive. So one day I think we'll be wearing AR glasses, but for now it's like looking at a thing on your phone and it coming to life. So this was in collaboration with an AR company, Discovery Education's immersive content wing, and they've been great in collaborating with me on, it's all clever programming stuff that I have no idea how to do, but being able to see the sculpture and know that it's there and then overlay animations over it. So yeah, the idea is that I've been building up to for years, and then lockdown has taken a few years out of it, and I feel like I'm going backwards, but an exhibition of sculptures that exist in AR that come to life. Imagining a space, and this is me testing AR because now I can do some basic things on my phone, but imagining making an exhibition space where it's totally immersive if you were wearing glasses and smoke and liquids coming out at you and stuff. Yeah, so that's what I want to make one day, but I don't know. It feels further away than it ever was. Right, and I'm also going to mention Claudia Dietz's work. So this was an artist I met on the Digital Stone project. She's from Germany, Stuttgart in Germany. And just an amazing artist. Her stonework is just on another level. Like, she can make a cuboid into a sphere in a fraction of the time it would take anyone else. I went to visit her and learn some of the techniques for hand stonework in Stuttgart, and I always figure a reason to use a digital process should never be because you can't do it the other way. So I always like to learn. So this was the other way around this time. So it was starting digital and then going back to hand carving. I was only there for a few days, but it was a brilliant process to learn very old school technique. This was a project that Ben Reed from Wild in Art. This was when we were we were still in lockdown. You couldn't go to galleries, so he had this idea of the 50 Windows project. So it was windows all across Manchester and putting artists in different windows. So it meant you could go for your walk but see some art. So I got a big spot at the Royal Northern College of Music, and it was a small fund, but so it was bringing some existing work, but also playing with a couple of new ideas. So I've gotten quite interested in this idea of plinths, and it was kind of like working to a budget. I could make a plinth for very little, an MDF plinth, and then actually making the art around it with these very small 3D printed parts. So those two white pieces were new for that. Then it snowed, and I lugged it into the middle of my local park to get some pictures. And then also during lockdown, just kind of going, right, I'm going to do some mad abstract expressionist paintings as well. So, tangent. So then going back to the plinth idea, which has been mainly what I've been working on for the last year or so. Again, it's been about simplifying the idea and simplifying it, and I've got the 3D printer so I can test out ideas, and it's just big. What I really want to do is even simplify it even more than these, to be honest, and just have these very basic plinths that are distorted. So I went back to Italy for this year's Digital Stone project, and that's a recent piece being milled, and that's it being finished. And you can see again, it's like keeping those mill lines in. And I've actually worked out a way so when I'm designing it, I can mimic the mill lines as I go along. So that's been another step up. I've now got the newer version of the motion capture. So this is me in my house, and I'm wearing a motion capture suit, gloves, and I've got a camera on my face. So this means in real time, I can now. There's my great acting abilities, and that's the camera attached to my body. I can now, in real time, it's real Gollum stuff, and it actually works, and it's quite fluid. There's me looking like an idiot. And then, so part of this project is I've got various collaborators lined up. So this time, this is Mouse. He's a 2 times B-Boy world champion. So this is about like pushing the technology as far as it can go. It's a bit glitchy, but this was like, we had an hour together. And it's just amazing compared to, what I was working with five years ago or whatever. I've also got a ballet dancer, Georgina Cartwright, lined up, and then 2 MCs from Manchester, Chunky and Strategy, who are amazing, to do sort of perform. They're going to write some pieces and perform wearing the suit, so it will be their facial reactions and movements and their hands and fingers and so on. This was very recent. It's like I think it's an 8-second clip. There's me, and I'm sculpting in VR, but I'm wearing the motion capture suit, so you can see the 3D character is weirdly kind of in VR. So it's a bit meta. The original concept was, and it kind of works, but it didn't work live because there was too much of a lag with the projectors, but that you could actually be wearing the suit and you could be designing the character while you were animating it, which was pleasingly double meta. But and I felt like I couldn't do this talk without mentioning AI, because that's like the new thing at the moment. So if you're not familiar with AI, it's just taken off AI generated artwork. So you can type in some words and it will do a digital painting that, like, something better than I would take a year, and I couldn't paint something with that level of complexity.
It's really upsetting, isn't it?
It's quite upsetting. Well, I think it's great. I think it's great, but it's only upsetting when artists don't mention it's AI and say, I've done a new digital painting, and you're like, no, you haven't. But you can't be bitch about these things. But so I started to experiment with. This is a video I'll just show you. This was a video I found online. A friend introduced me to Liko's choreography, and I loved it. I have asked her for permission, or if she wants to collaborate. I heard that from her. But so this was a few years ago, and I was like, what can I do with these videos? And I started to add these trails and didn't get anywhere with it. But then with the AI, I was like, oh, that video with the trails. And then so what I would have done with this is just the prompts I would have used would have been like abstract, neon, robot. But essentially with AI, you could do, human giraffe, and it would make that person into that. So there's a lot of potential. I'm very clear on what I think is acceptable, what's cheating and what's lying, and tracing is cheating, but sometimes it's not. The thing about tracing just feels like the biggest shortcut you can take. But then I saw an artist just say, whatever it takes for you to get into it, just do it and enjoy it. And I felt bad for being so strict. This is the last video that I was going to show if I was ahead of time, but...
Get it on,
yeah. Oh, right, okay.
Because the potato has a very simple rhythm, a 24-hour rhythm. It doesn't have a complicated life pattern. If the potato cannot survive out of the Earth's sphere of influence, then I would be very, very cautious if I were concerned with the total problem of sending man out into outer space until I had found out what it was that the potato lacked in order to permit it to survive out there.
So I'd like to say thank you so much indeed.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for having me walk the plank. Host.
Make you walk the plank.
Yeah?
We'll make you walk the plank.